Hello, everybody. It's Mr. Caudell. How you doing? I'm doing okay. I'm stoked. We're still in evolution. Let's finish chapter 22, which is the first chapter out of 4 or 5 that are in evolution. Specifically, we're here at 22.3, which is where people say, okay, great, you have this theory. Who cares? A lot of people have a lot of theories about a lot of things. Prove it. And so that's what Darwin did for 20 years is he did experiments in his house to try to prove his theory correct. We have a lot of evidence for evolution, and it has been substantiated over the years. And so now it's a really well established theory. Often what happens and what is kind of cool in math and science is that someone will come up with a theory, they'll even have data to reinforce that theory, and then over time, like over 50 years, 100 years, people will actually come up with data to show that it's wrong. And in fact, oftentimes it's oppositely wrong. I think that it's one of the most fascinating things that ever happens in my field. But this is a theory that has stood up over the test of time. And what has happened is over the thousands of experiments that have been done on evolutionary science since he published this stuff, it's just been reinforced. And now people call it the trump card, or the super reinforcing bit of information is now a biochemical information, which is DNA analysis. And now we can analyze DNA of 2 individuals, 2 different species, and then see how evolutionarily related they are. And that has only further enhanced Darwin's reputation. It's pretty cool. I must admit, I am thinking about the environment every day, but I'm concerned about us, and I'm just concerned about us thrashing on our environment and not taking care of Mother Earth. So do your part. I'm going to try to do mine. I'm certainly not infallible, but I can always do better, and so I'm going to strive to do so. I hope you do the same. Well, in the last portion of this chapter, we went over these observations which Darwin had made on his journey and which he had kind of solidified down into inferences. So let's do this. Describe these observations and the inferences that led Darwin to propose natural selection as a mechanism for evolutionary change. Don't write down the answer, just turn to your neighbor or whoever you're with and let them know what you know. You can go back to that picture if you need to. Well, if in fact these observations and then the inferences that come from them are correct, they explain the match between organisms and their environment. Let's take, for example, this anteater, a face only a mother can love, obviously. How did he evolve? To have those flattened ears, that long snout, and that super long sticky tongue, to stick down into ant hives, literally feet down into them, and just pull up ants. Could you imagine if that was your diet? And here's the answer. If any organism in a population has a trait that's advantageous and it is able to be inherited by the offspring, they will accumulate in any population, such as this anteater in the population, until the environment changes. The whole point is that there was an environment where that trait was giving its organism that had it an advantage, and then it was able to reproduce and pass that along through inheritance. The point is, if the environment changes, all of a sudden, if we have an ice age, or we have global warming, or we have flooding, or we have a huge fire that keeps coming through an area over thousands of years, the environment can change. And then all of a sudden, that trait is no longer advantageous. The trait that had previously accumulated in the population. I'm going to keep reading. This will increase the frequency of individuals with these adaptations if it is beneficial. So I want you to just pause this and write these 2 sentences down. They're that important. And then remember, kids say to me, oh, what should I look at before the test? Well, these would be great sentences to certainly review before the exam. The whole point here is that if you get enough of these traits accumulating, the organisms in that population with those newfound traits that give them an advantage might look and act and reproduce so differently after a while that they can no longer reproduce with individuals that are over there that never accumulated those same traits that they did. Maybe those individuals stayed in an environment that was a little bit different. And now you might call them separate species if they can't have babies. Please write this down too. Individuals don't evolve. So you can't ever say, oh, that anteater or that lizard with variation in color is evolving. The whole idea is that populations evolve. And we're going to get into the math behind this. We're going to do a lab on this. It starts in chapter 23. Don't worry about the details behind this, but right now, but in chapter 22, just understand that it's individuals in a population who are struggling to survive that might pass along these characteristics, but it's not them who are evolving. It's when you pull back and you look at the whole population over time, you say that population is evolving. Well, I have this little piece of paper that I've kind of put all these essential knowledges from the College Board on, and these are the things that the College Board are going to use in order to create your exam. So as far as essential knowledge, 1.A.4, biological evolution is supported by scientific evidence from many disciplines. The idea is that here is the evidence for evolution, and that's why we're going to go over them on the board. That's why I'm having you read 22.3. The good news is, is that this is stuff that you learn in 10th grade, at least at Battle Mountain High School. We've gone over these before, so we're just going to reinforce them, and I'll give you a little bit more information. Well, here's Darwin's book on the origin of species. This is where he put all of his evidence, and this is why he is credited for the theory and not Alfred Wallace. He has some great pictures in here of troops. It looks like there's a troop from the New World down there in South Asia on the left-hand beat that it's riding, and then of course there's a British guy on a carrot. Isn't that awesome? You know, my wife and I were watching Antiques Roadshow one time, and we were like, okay, sweet, we enjoy this show. It's on public broadcasting. It's where people bring in antiques and then they get them appraised, and sometimes they're like, oh, it was a fake all along, I thought it was worth a lot. Or they're like, this junky thing was in a drawer, and then someone says it's worth $100,000. It's a pretty neat show. Anyway, this lady found a copy of On the Origin of Species, and I had read that only a few hundred copies were ever made in that first printing there. And so the question becomes, how much is this worth, this book? What do you think it's worth? She found it in an attic, and she said $200,000, what she learned on this show. And it was a thrill for me because obviously this is one of the seminal volumes of literature that helped guide my profession. And so I thought it was exciting. I've seen one of these. Of course, it was behind thick glass, and there was a guard nearby. And I saw it in Philadelphia where the Liberty Bell is. If you've ever been there, there's Freedom Hall, and I think something's there. It's not I think it's the Declaration of Independence, because that's where they did all the signing. And then the Constitution and Bill of Rights, I believe, are in Washington. But the point is I don't know why the Yanks have it, but we have one of these first copies of the 1,250 volumes that were published of Darwin's book, and it's behind glass, and you can go there and you can see it. So if you're ever in Philadelphia, make sure you go see it, and just, I don't know, I'd say think of me or think about nature, think about evolution, what you think when you see it. Maybe it'll be decades from now, but I hope it gives you a thrill. Like it gave me a thrill for sure. Well, let's talk about fossils. Darwin, on his journey, he collected a ton of fossils. And what he noticed was that present day organisms kind of looked like the fossils that he was finding. I'm going to tell you, now we know that only 0.1% of organisms that are on this planet alive right now that's the portion of organisms that has ever lived on our planet. Here's let me say it another way. 99.9% of all organisms that have ever lived on this planet are gone. And so often we don't have any fossils of them, but sometimes we unearth weird fossils, and Darwin did, and he was trying to piece together in his mind, using these works of Lyell and Hutton and all this geology stuff, how all this played together, because he saw that the fossils were down within sedimentary layers, which meant that they were old. He could try to date them, and he tried to start to piece together this whole theory of evolution. One individual that he was very interested in were marine mammals, a group of individuals, like porpoises and whales and dolphins and seals and all these mammals that breathe air. They don't breathe oxygen diffused in water like fish do with gills, but they actually have like a nose. And this guy's on top of his head. He was interested, how did they get there? And so he had some ideas, and his idea was that, hey, maybe they all came from a land-dwelling mammal at one time. And if that's the case, then we should be able to find fossils of what he called transitional forms. And this was one of the examples that he gave. And you can see that this organism is starting to become more and more like a marine dwelling mammal in its body shape over time. Well, in fact, we have found these such sets of bones. And the original kind of wolf-like mammal that they believed that lived on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea was, they call it now Pakicetus, so it was probably near Pakistan. I don't even know if that's on the Mediterranean. But the point is that there was this dog-like animal, and so the idea is that, hey, maybe it found the water a rich source of food, or a haven from its own predators, or it had just had some sort of advantage there, and maybe that maybe it was able to do better than others as it was cruising around, and it could dunk its head under and try to get a fish. And then you can imagine that there were individuals in this population that looked a little bit differently and behaved a little bit differently than others, and maybe they had an advantage in that newfound environment that the population was trying to exploit. They ate more, they had more success, they reproduced, they passed along those characteristics, and then thousands of generations later, the new kind of population doesn't even look like the old population anymore. And you can kind of see how things would change over time or evolve over time in a population here. Here's Jourdan, and here's our baleen. It means the baleen that whales use to filter like krill and stuff like that. So that wouldn't be like these individuals that have teeth that are carnivores here, super carnivores. I don't know why it's called baleen, but you can still see the remnants of the pelvis and hind limbs, even in today's whales, which is really cool. And so that suggests, why would they have that? Well, it suggests that maybe at one time their ancestors dwelled on land. So these are called transitional forms. They're going to talk about this in your textbook, and they're going to show you this timeline of a common ancestor of all these cetaceans, which are these individuals that live in the water, or the salt water, and then they're going to try to make an argument how they're related to mammals that are living on land today. Well, the fossil record provides evidence of the extinction of species, the origin of new groups, and changes within groups over time. So with Darwin, the fact that he was wealthy and that he belonged to the Zoological Society of London, he would go to lectures all the time, and he would get to see these fossils. And so some random scientist wouldn't have had access to all that, but he did. And that's all he did. He didn't have a job. He just went and he just learned. He was an academic for decades and decades and decades. And so he started to piece together this stuff. And in some ways, he was the perfect candidate to do all that he did because of his wealthy background and all the time he had, and his intelligence and his I guess fearlessness at the end there. Well, another argument that he made, and that others have made too, is we can look at embryos. Now, embryos are organisms that are still in gestation in mama's belly, and they are developing before they become fully living on their own out in nature. And we can look at embryos and we can compare things, and we can say, well, where's the head and where's the body and all these things. And you can see the pharyngeal pouch here. The idea is that the pharynx is a place where the windpipe and food pipe kind of come together. And what we found is that embryos have of all sorts of organisms. We're talking like reptiles, fish, mammals, amphibians. They all have the same gill slits. And I think that's what they're talking about with these pouches. And the question is, why would a mammal, like a human embryo, have gill slits at the same period of embryologic development as, say, a fish, or a post-anal tail? So you have an anus, and then they're saying after the anus, a tail. Why would we have these things in our development? And then, okay, you don't see them on normally on a normal grown human, but why would we have them unless maybe we were once, I guess, related or have a common ancestor from all these other organisms that I mentioned? So if this is a chicken embryo on the left and you see a human embryo on the right, why do they have the same structures when you look at a human and a chicken and they're so different? These are anatomical homologies not visible in adult organisms, but some scientists like to say the action is in the embryos. That's where you can see all these great things through development and relatedness that you can't really see in fully grown organisms. Well, I have this picture here, and what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to try to point on the screen where the human is, the turtle, the rabbit, the fish, the pig, the horse. Where are they? Which ones of these are those organisms? And the idea is that what I'm trying to do is just illustrate to you that they all look the same, generally speaking, at the same portion of embryologic development. And why do they? Darwin said, hey, why do we have all these structures common with turtles and pigs and horses at this portion of development unless we were once related to them? So go ahead and point out the turtle, the pig. What do you think these things are? And so let me read it to you. We have a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a human. Now, if that doesn't help you to lose sleep tonight, I don't know what will. Isn't that crazy how they were so similar, but then they become so different in the end? I think that's fascinating. That's one of his arguments for evolution. He also said, well, what about vestigial structures? So what I'd like you to do is look at your neighbor and see that little flap of skin there in the corner of their eye. That's called a nictitating membrane. And the idea is that we don't use it anymore, but some organisms do, like a crocodile or an alligator. When they submerge, it's like a third eyelid that will go over their eye so that they can have their eye open, and they have this transparent film protecting the eye. There are people that are born who, when they humans, when they open up their eye, you can see like kind of more pronounced remnants of this nictitating membrane. It kind of moves or flutters a little bit. And then I'm sure some people were born with that thing fully functional. And that's just nature tinkering again. His argument was, well, why do we have these vestigial structures like a nictitating membrane unless we used them in our evolutionary past? And then that would suggest relatedness to other organisms and then eventually a common organism. Another one would be wisdom teeth. When long ago, we had more of a plant diet. We have like canine teeth now to tear away at meat. But before that, it was mostly a plant diet for our kind. And so we had another row of teeth to help grind down those plants, and flat teeth, not pointed teeth like meat-eating teeth, but flat teeth to help just grind it further, the plant stuff. And then the idea is that through evolution, our human skulls got smaller. And so now there's just no more room for that. Now, some people have wisdom teeth, some people don't. Some people need to get them removed because they're crowded in there, and some people don't. And so that's just nature tinkering. And it all comes down, remember, to this. When I say tinkering, what I mean is the kind of commonly accepted and witnessed mutations on DNA. They just happen for all those reasons that we talked about in the first semester and earlier in chapter 22. And when those happen, proteins change. Now, often that means nothing. It's a neutral change, or it doesn't help or hurt the organism. But sometimes it does hurt the organism or help the organism. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of people in these genes that are being passed down that control wisdom teeth formation. Well, if you Google it, there are individuals, humans, who have remnants of tails. And one of Darwin's arguments was, why do we have a coccyx or a tailbone unless we once had a tail? And so sometimes people are born with tails. Sometimes people are born with more nipples. I had a student years ago in this class, and she told me that like older purebred dogs, she had hip dysplasia. Like she was pretty, she was 18, but she said that her hips were weak, and that I guess the ball at the top of the humerus, the ball at the top of the femur wouldn't fit as well into the kind of the pocket there as well as others, and it was always loose. And she also told me, and I never looked, of course, but she just said to me, hey, and I'm kind of dog-like in the sense that I have multiple nipples. She didn't ask for multiple nipples. It just happened. She said, and I remember one of my friends in college had an extra nipple, and no one knew what it was, but it was just like there. And so the point is that everyone has their thing, and everyone's has DNA that's just kind of trying new things all the time, and maybe something's better. If all the global ice caps melt and the sea levels rise, human individuals who have webbed fingers and hands who didn't have apoptosis go on these cells may have an advantage if we have to swim places. I'm halfway kidding, but not kidding. I mean, this is how evolution occurs. And then if those individuals, 100,000 years ago are from now have such an advantage that they are able to reproduce better, get more resources, and that's how evolution occurs. And so anyway, there's one more that I want to point out to you, and that's the appendix. Now we have an appendix, and it's like a cecum, which is found in today's plant eaters. And the cecum is just this blind pouch, which just means off the large intestine of a cow, for instance. It's just a pouch where a bunch of bacteria lives, and digested food gets in there, and it's further broken down, essentially. We don't use it, but sometimes it gets inflamed because stuff gets in there, foodstuffs, and then it can become septic, and people have to get their appendix out, right? Or else if it ruptures, the bacterial colonies that are bad would go into the bloodstream and cause someone to die, potentially. Now, some would say, well, why would we have the appendix unless we used it at some point in our evolutionary past, similar to what current animals do with food in the large intestine? And then some others would say, well, you're wrong, because the appendix is still used. There's an example, if you're in class, I'll show you an article that I have of this lady, this native Eskimo woman who would eat duck that was shot by buckshot. And so it was like this pellets that, there would be, every shot had like 50 pellets or whatever. It would kill the ducks, and that's fine. But she didn't have any teeth, and she was in northern Alaska. And so she would basically cook the meat and then gum the meat, as much as she could, and then digest it. But the point is that she never would spit out the little balls, the metal balls. And so what happened was she went through the airport security in Anchorage. She was trying to board a flight, and they kept beeping her for metal. And she's like, okay, I got no metal. And then they basically checked every pocket and everything, and she had no metal. And what they realized after an x-ray was that her appendix was where all that metal from all those little tiny pellets was being stored. So the appendix does have a job. Right. Well, we actually went backwards there. So Darwin also made an argument that organisms have homologous structures. Now, these are structures that are similar in their structure, but in different species. And he said, well, why would a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat basically have one bone, two bones, a cluster of bones that we call the wrist, and then 5 or 4, 3 digits emanating away from that wrist, unless we were all once the same species or we had a common ancestor? There's many different ways to form an arm or a forelimb. Why do we all do it the same way unless we all came from a common ancestor? So these are called homologous structures here. Homologous structures are anatomical resemblances that represent variations on a structural theme present in a common ancestor. Remember, everything here is made by DNA. So we can compare DNA, and that's what we would like to do in order to create relationships among different groups. It's kind of the best way to do it, because all these things that I'm talking about, all these vestigial structures and comparing embryos, and if we look at fossils and these homologous structures, what are all these structures created from? Well, from a message on DNA. So if we can say, oh, these things are related evolutionarily. Look at a chimp, look at a human. They must be more evolutionarily related than a chimp and a snail. You could say that by looking at all these things, but really the best way to do it is to look at the DNA. And this is not something that Darwin had. So DNA sequence data is now what we have, and you could look at percent homology within DNA. If you compare 1,000 letters on DNA, how many letters are the same in the same place between two species? For us in a chimp, it's like 98 point something percent, but for us in a rat, it's like 65%. And so you could say, well, the more closely related the DNA sequences are, the more closely related two things are evolutionarily, which means they had a common ancestor more recently than those two organisms, and then something else like a snail or a mouse, if we're talking about a human or a chimp. And then you can make those arguments. So DNA comparison really is the best thing that we can do. We will do a lab in this class where we have a computer compare DNA sequences, and then we'll be able to construct evolutionary trees based upon that. Well, here's a picture from your book. This is just a little activity I want you to do. Turn to your neighbor and tell them, are you more closely related to lizards or birds? You're going to get very comfortable working with these types of pictures. What this is a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram. The idea is that you can represent evolutionary relationships. Excuse me, we'll try to back it up with math, but what I want you to always do is put a timeline on the x-axis, and where all the pictures are of the organisms on the right side of this slide, that's present day, let's say, and then go back in time. So are you more closely related to a lizard or a bird? So if you find mammals, then you go back to the left, back in time to number 3. That's a common ancestor that we had with lizards and snakes and crocodiles and ostriches and hawks and other birds. The question becomes, do we have a more recent to present day common ancestor with lizards or with birds? And the answer is number 6. We have a more closely related in time common ancestor with birds. More recently, we had a common ancestor than we did with lizards. How about birds or amphibians? You try to answer that. Well, you can see if you have a timeline on the x-axis that you have to go way back in time to common ancestor number 2 for our ancestor with amphibians. It's even further back in time, probably tens of millions of years, than our number 3 common ancestor with all those other organisms we just talked about. And so the point is that we are more closely related to birds than we are to amphibians. Even though amphibians are closer to us kind of in this picture, we had to go further back in time in order to achieve that common ancestor, which was the blue number 2 that you see. Well, we're almost done here. You can look at these organisms and you can say, well, they all live in the ocean and they look alike. So maybe they're closely related on the evolutionary tree. Now, of course, they are, generally speaking, because they all have a mouth and eyes and they have flippers and skin and so on. But let's just look at a tiny portion of the evolutionary tree where we have mammals over here and reptiles over here and fish over here. Then you can say, well, they're not closely related, really. Mammals are this huge group, fishes are this huge group, and they don't really intermingle as far as being closely related. They may have had a common ancestor tens of millions of years ago. But someone might say, well, but they look exactly the same, just like a chimp and a human, right? So they must be closely related. And you could say, well, they've evolved convergently. And so think about what the term converge means. To diverge means to go like this, and to converge means to go like this. This occurs when similar environmental pressures, such as trying to survive as a predator in the ocean, and natural selection produce similar adaptations in organisms from very different evolutionary lineages. These are called analogous characteristics. They're analogs of one another, but they're not homologs, meaning they didn't come from the same. They just are similar, but they didn't come from the same. It's almost like wings on bats, and then wings on butterflies, and then wings on birds. They all do the same things. They're analogous structures, but they didn't immediately come from a common ancestor. Example your book is going to give is of the sugar glada and the flying squirrel of North America. They do the same thing, but they aren't necessarily super closely related. They evolved these abilities to soar through the air and fly on different continents after Pangaea broke up. And so it's got to be tens of millions of years since you can find a common ancestor between these two guys. These are examples of convergent evolution. It's when groups independently adapt to similar environments in similar ways. Would you like to see a video of a sugar glider? Me too. Man, that's exciting. I'd love to see one of those. My hope is that when you're watching this, that the outback is not on fire, because it traditionally, the fire season for them is in the winter when you might be watching this. So I'm thinking about the outback and all the native species of Australia. Finally, last argument for evolution. The evidence that Darwin gave was something called biogeography. So the idea is that we can look at different regions of geography and we can make biological conclusions from that. I'm going to read to you this sentence I have here. It's the distribution of organisms across the globe, and it's explainable by assuming that related forms evolved in one locale. So islands are great places for this. So islands have endemic species that are often closely related to species on the nearest mainland or island, but you don't see anywhere else. So let me give you an example. We'll go to one that you already know, Darwin's finches, or the turtles, or the iguanas, or the snakes that are on the Galapagos. As far as the finches go, you have 13 islands, and each island has its own species of finch, and they're more closely related if you look at their DNA homologous sequence comparisons than any of them are to any species on the mainland. There's only 2 species of finch on the Ecuadorian mainland, but there's 13 species, and in a place that has far less surface area. And so through biogeography, one could say, well, what happened is adaptive radiation. We know that these are more closely related through DNA comparison. And so what must have happened is that something came somewhere, and then because it was a new niche in an environment, it radiated out into all these pockets where it had little bits of advantageous characteristics, and then those reinforced over thousands of generations, and now we have these different species that you see today. Let me give you a couple more examples. When Laurasia, I think Gondwanaland was up top when Pangaea broke up, and Laurasia was at the bottom, although I don't see Asia here in this picture. The idea is that there's this Permian freshwater reptile fossil, which I'll show you in a second. But there's fossils that are found of this organism in Brazil, right there on the corner in Recife, Brazil, and then also in Ghana, which is in sub-Saharan Africa. The point is why would you have fossils for 2 organisms that are like the same, but now they're separated by 2,000 or 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean? And so the idea is that they must be related to one another, and they must have lived back when they could literally cross over this bridge of water there. Here's this Permian freshwater reptile fossil found in both Brazil and Ghana. Pretty neat. Current distribution of fossils reflects the movement of continental drift. In fact, they reinforce one another. Well, we are able to make conclusions about drifting continents based on fossils that we find and vice versa. I think it's pretty cool how they reinforce one another, those 2 theories. Press pause and go ahead and speak these out loud, 18, 19, and 20. I think they're very good. Thanks. I hope you liked chapter 22 as much as I do.